My family declared me dead to steal my inheritance. They told everyone, he's gone forever, signed the papers, divided my fortune, and spent 15 years enjoying a life built on my name. The proof of their betrayal hung on the wall in front of me. A giant portrait of my younger self stood above a polished marble memorial plaque, while soft piano music echoed through the company ballroom. Employees, investors, and relatives dressed in black sipped champagne beneath a banner that read 15 years since his passing. I stood unnoticed near the entrance watching. My mother laughed at something my uncle whispered. My brother adjusted the expensive watch he had bought with money that was never his. Around them, people shared stories about the man they believed had died long ago. About me, the air smelled of flowers and old lies. Then the host stepped onto the stage and announced the arrival of the company's new owner. I smiled, stepped forward, and watched every face in the room turn white. 15 years earlier, I had been the youngest executive in our family's manufacturing business, a company my grandfather built from a single warehouse and decades of sacrifice. While my relatives enjoyed the reputation that came with our name, I was the one studying contracts at midnight, meeting suppliers before sunrise, and solving problems no one else wanted to touch. My grandfather noticed. He used to tell me that quiet people reveal themselves through actions, not promises. It was one of the reasons he trusted me with responsibilities long before anyone expected. The rest of my family saw things differently. To them, I was useful but forgettable. The dependable son who would fix the crisis, accept the blame, and never demand recognition afterward. My older brother loved attention. My uncle loved control. My mother spent years convincing herself that family loyalty mattered more than fairness. I spent years believing the same thing. When my grandfather passed away, his will named me primary heir to both his personal estate and controlling shares of the company. The decision shocked everyone except him. I remember the silence that followed the reading of the will. The warning signs appeared long before my family officially erased me. After the will was read, conversations changed in ways that were difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. When company decisions were discussed, people stopped making eye contact with me. My suggestions were met with polite smiles followed by long silences. Then, a few minutes later, the exact same idea would be repeated by someone else and suddenly praised as brilliant. At family dinners, my uncle would casually joke that inheritance often landed in the wrong hands. Everyone would laugh except me. My brother became especially careful around me. Too careful. He started asking questions about legal documents, insurance policies, and company ownership structures with an interest he had never shown before. Whenever I answered, I noticed him exchanging brief glances with my uncle across the table. The looks lasted only seconds, but they happened often. My mother changed as well. Whenever I spoke about expanding the business or honoring my grandfather's plans, she would gently redirect the conversation elsewhere, as if certain topics made her uncomfortable. At the time, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Families have tensions. Businesses create jealousy. That was the explanation I chose. Looking back now, I realized something else was happening. They weren't adjusting to my inheritance. They were quietly preparing to take it from me. The moment everything changed did not come with a dramatic confrontation. It arrived in the form of a bank statement. A few weeks after the tension within the family became impossible to ignore, I discovered that several company accounts had been accessed using authorization codes that only a handful of people should have known. At first, I assumed it was an administrative mistake. Then I followed the paper trail. What I found was disturbing, not because of the money itself, but because of the coordination behind it. Documents had been moved, records had been altered, decisions were being made without my knowledge, yet somehow carried my approval. The deeper I looked, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't jealousy. It wasn't family conflict. It was preparation. Someone was building a version of reality where I could be removed without disrupting their plans. For days, I barely slept. I sat alone in my office long after sunset, staring at spreadsheets, signatures, and timelines that fit together too perfectly to be coincidence. Then I reached a conclusion I could no longer avoid. If I stayed, I would lose everything, not because they were stronger, because they were willing to do things I never imagined family would do. That night, I stopped trying to save the relationship. For the first time, I focused on protecting myself. I quietly gathered copies of every record I could find, secured evidence in places no one could reach, and prepared for whatever came next. I didn't know exactly what they were planning, but I finally understood one thing. The greatest threat to my future wasn't outside the family. It was sitting at my family's dinner table. I had spent years negotiating contracts, evaluating risk, and solving business disputes. One lesson appeared in every successful strategy. Never react before you understand the entire board. So, instead of confronting anyone, I became patient. I organized every document. I had collected and created a detailed timeline of transactions, approvals, and communications. Copies were stored in multiple secure locations. If anything happened to me, the records would survive. Then I quietly disappeared. The official story surrounding my disappearance grew larger each year, but I never challenged it. In fact, I allowed people to believe whatever version benefited them most. While my family celebrated control of the company, I built a new life under a different identity overseas. I completed advanced business certifications, worked with investment firms, and spent years studying corporate acquisitions, governance law, and forensic accounting. Knowledge became my advantage. The same relatives who underestimated me continued making a critical mistake. They assumed the story was finished. It wasn't. Through trusted attorneys and holding companies, I began tracking the business from a distance. Public filings, shareholder reports, and financial disclosures revealed weaknesses they didn't realize were visible. I never rushed. I never threatened. I simply waited. Year after year, I watched them grow comfortable, careless, and dependent on assets they believed belonged to them forever. By the time I made my move, it wasn't driven by anger. It was mathematics. Every contract, every acquisition, and every decision was calculated months in advance. They thought they had erased me from the story. What they didn't realize was that I had spent 15 years quietly preparing to write the final chapter myself. When the memorial host announced the arrival of the company's new owner, polite applause filled the ballroom. Then I stepped into the light. The reaction was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses froze halfway to people's lips. The soft piano music continued playing, creating an almost surreal contrast to the silence spreading through the room. My brother was the first to recognize me. The color drained from his face. My mother's smile vanished so quickly it looked as though someone had switched off a light behind her eyes. I walked calmly toward the stage, carrying a folder no thicker than a magazine. No anger, no dramatic speech, just facts. The acquisition had been completed legally through a chain of investments and shareholder agreements accumulated over several years. Their controlling position had disappeared long before they realized it. The company now belonged to me. Then came the second revelation. My attorneys distributed copies of documents showing inconsistencies in historical records, forged authorizations, and transactions connected to the years surrounding my disappearance. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing was hidden. The evidence spoke for itself. I watched executives, investors, and board members quietly read the pages. Expressions shifted from confusion to disbelief and finally understanding. No one argued. No one could. The room that had spent 15 years celebrating my absence was suddenly forced to confront my presence. For a moment, I looked at the memorial portrait hanging above the stage. Then I smiled, not because I had destroyed them, because the truth no longer needed me to defend it. It was standing on its own, in front of everyone. The aftermath was quieter than I had imagined. There were no dramatic arrests in the ballroom, and no cinematic confessions. Real consequences rarely arrive that way. Instead, they unfolded over the following months. Board members launched independent investigations. Auditors reviewed years of records. Investors who had trusted my family's leadership began asking difficult questions. One by one, the people who had benefited from the deception found themselves explaining decisions. They could no longer hide behind excuses. Some resigned. Others disappeared from public view altogether. The hardest reaction to watch was my mother's. For years, she had convinced herself that protecting the lie was the same as protecting the family. When the truth became public, she lost both. Every conversation between us felt like two strangers standing on opposite sides of a river that could never be crossed again. My brother tried reaching out several times. I listened once. Then I realized he wanted forgiveness more than accountability. The company survived. In many ways, it became stronger than it had ever been. Employees who had lived under uncertainty finally saw stability return, and that mattered more to me than revenge. But the greatest change was personal. For 15 years, I had carried the weight of being erased, betrayed and forgotten. Now that burden was gone. In the end, the inheritance was never the most valuable thing I recovered. It was my name. And after all those years, reclaiming it felt worth far more than any fortune they had stolen. In the years that followed, people often asked whether the revenge felt satisfying. The truth surprised them. What brought me peace was not watching others lose everything. It was discovering that I no longer needed their approval to feel whole. For most of my life, I had measured my worth through family loyalty, believing that sacrifice would eventually be recognized and returned. When that belief collapsed, I was forced to build something stronger: self-respect. That depended on no one else's opinion. The company continued to grow under new leadership. Employees focused on the future instead of old scandals. New projects replaced old conflicts. For the first time in decades, the business felt guided by purpose rather than entitlement. As for my family, I stopped following every detail of their lives. Some distances exist for a reason. I wished them accountability, not destruction. That difference mattered. My grandfather once told me that character is revealed when no one is watching. For years I thought he meant hard work and discipline. Now I understand he meant something deeper. You discover who you are when life gives you every reason to become bitter and you choose not to. The memorial portrait that once symbolized my disappearance now hangs in my office. Not as a reminder of betrayal, as proof of survival. Because the greatest revenge was never reclaiming the fortune they stole. It was returning from the grave they created and building a life. So strong that their betrayal could no longer define it. Not grief, not disappointment, something colder. For the first time, I saw my relatives looking at me not as family, but as an obstacle standing between them, and everything they believed should have been theirs.